A United Nations commission has concluded that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. It had previously accused Israel of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Israel has denounced the latest allegations as fake. And the Palestinian death toll could get much higher after Israel launches a ground assault on Gaza City. Thousands of Palestinians have already fled as the bombardment continues. I will discuss all of this with our panel shortly, but first I'm joined by Michael Lynk. He is a former UN Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in the Palestinian territories, and he's Professor Emeritus of Law at Western University. Michael Lynk, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with that report that's just been released by this UN panel. It was an independent United Nations panel that says Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinians. What were some of the key findings that led to this conclusion?
The Independent Commission of Inquiry set up by the United Nations in 2021 has released a number of reports regarding Israel and Palestine over the last 4 years. This is probably its most consequential report over those 4 years. It found, as other organizations have found, that genocide is being committed in Gaza by Israel with respect to its policy of starvation of the civilian population, with respect to its indiscriminate bombing of the civilian population and the high number of civilian deaths and injuries. It's the devastation of all of the aspects of community life: homes, hospitals, schools, universities, mosques, shops that make community life possible. It's come to the conclusion that Israel's actions have a genocidal acts, that is, to destroy a people in whole or in part, and it's committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part these people, evidenced by various statements made by the Prime Minister of Israel, the President of Israel, defense ministers of Israel, and other important cabinet ministers in Israel as well. Overall, this is a factually very rich report, which I think will have a lot of resonance in the weeks and months to come.
Now, the United Nations has no enforcement mechanism of its own, but still, as you pointed out a moment ago, this report is consequential. How significant is it?
Well, I think it's going to be consequential in two different bodies. First of all, we're just about to open up the fall 2025 session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. This report, I'm sure, will be a central feature in the debates and the resolutions over the next 3 months with respect to how the international community is reacting to this ongoing genocide in Gaza, and particularly with the conclusions found by this independent commission. The other area where it's going to have, I think, great resonance is going to be at the International Court of Justice. We all know that approximately 18 months ago, South Africa brought an application under the Genocide Convention, arguing that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The International Court of Justice said that South Africa had made out a plausible case of genocide. It's now receiving arguments and evidence, and will probably hear arguments sometime next year in an oral setting in The Hague by Israel, by South Africa, and by maybe a number of intervening countries as well. This particular report, I think, will be central to the considerations of the court as it determines the question of whether or not there is genocide being committed.
The report does name people. It names the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It names the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and the Israeli President Isaac Herzog of inciting genocide, and it is holding the government responsible. How damning is that?
Well, those statements have already been circulated fairly widely. That was at the core of the interim decision made by the International Court of Justice back in January 2024. They relied on those very statements made by the President, the Prime Minister, and the former Defense Minister. It certainly has given both the former Defense Minister and the Prime Minister a black name in the international community. And of course, it was influential, I think, in the decision by the other important court, the International Criminal Court, in November of 2024 to issue arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for, among other allegations, that using the policy of starvation against the civilian population and the method by which the war was conducted by the mass killing of civilians in Gaza.
Now, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, she's also been speaking out on this genocide. Let's listen to some of what she said.
Far too many states continue to look away, normalize the suffering, and they even profit from it. Arms, trade, and diplomatic engagement with Israel continue unabated, and this is not just morally wrong, this is unlawful. But today's genocide has something different. It's openly incited, cynically denied, and relentlessly supported, armed, and weaponized, while those who oppose it are silenced, beaten, criminalized, and smeared.
Now, Israel has dismissed this report as anti-Semitic lies. It says it's a fake, it's a distortion. The United States continues to shield Israel. But is it going to be more difficult and harder for Israel to deny what is happening while it continues to smear any opposition to that?
Look, we've had authoritative voice after authoritative voice over the last year saying that this is a genocide. We've had Amnesty International. We've had Human Rights Watch saying there are genocidal acts going on. We've had human rights groups within Israel, such as B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel, say this is genocide. We've had Doctors Without Borders saying that this is genocide. We've had my successor, Francesca Albanese, issue 3 reports to the UN concluding that genocide is being committed. And now we have this particular report, rich in fact, rich in legal analysis, concluding that it is genocide. Simply dismissing this as being Hamas propaganda or anti-Semitic, I don't think carries much weight anymore. These allegations and denials by Israel, I think, are ringing increasingly hollow, and they've never produced any kind of report that is meant to refute factually and legally these damning conclusions that all of these reports have come to.
Now, Israel has just unleashed more of its troops on Gaza City. It's launched this ground assault in that area. 20,000 troops are involved in that. This is the most densely populated area of Gaza right now. So, I mean, do you expect the civilian death toll to rise a lot more?
With great heartbreak, I'm afraid that it's going to continue to rise. We've seen on our screens the last couple of days the immense destruction going on with virtually every tall tower, and these are almost all either offices or residential towers being destroyed by Israel. We have roughly, up until last month, around 1 million people living in and around Gaza City. They have all been ordered to go to the south. The UN has sent out warnings continually since the Israeli announcement in late August that it can't care for the 1 million or so Palestinians already in the south of Gaza with respect to food, fuel, water, health services, let alone expect another 1 million to arrive on this. Keep in mind that Gaza, before October 2023, was already one of the most densely populated areas in the world. We now have over 2 million Palestinians being herded into something like about 22% of Gaza, mostly along sand dunes on the center and the south of Gaza beside the Mediterranean Sea. This is going to be a catastrophe. Another thing to keep in mind is that the UN declared that Gaza City had reached the highest stage of food insecurity, i.e. a famine, in late August. You're now telling these 1 million people, most of whom have no other transport aside from their feet, who are in weak physical conditions, to move south 20, 30, 40 kilometers to join another 1 million Palestinians who are in a phase 4 classification, which means a catastrophic phase of lack of food, and where it's quite likely that the UN in early October will reassess and determine whether or not the south of Gaza is now also in a man-made famine as well.
As you mentioned earlier, the United Nations General Assembly is getting underway in New York. Now, ahead of that, some Western countries, notably the United Kingdom, France, Britain, Canada, Belgium, and Australia, may move to recognize a Palestinian state. What does that mean in practical terms? Does that change anything?
Sure. At one level, it does. The recognition by these Western countries of the state of Palestine is both a rebuke to Israel, but also puts, I think, obligations on the Frances and the United Kingdoms and Canadas of the world that they have to recognize the sovereignty of the state of Palestine over its territory, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and that could mean something meaningful. At another level, one could quite easily argue this is too little, too late. The world has been watching with eyes wide open over the last 40 years as the settlements and the number of settlers continues to rise exponentially. In 2002, when the United Nations and led by the United States under George Bush talked about a roadmap to peace with a Palestinian state, there were something like 275,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank alone. Today, a little over 20 years later, there are 525,000 settlers in the West Bank alone, another 235,000 in Jerusalem. I don't understand where the global North, in recognizing the state of Palestine, has developed a strategy to end the occupation, to have these settlements and these settlers removed from the occupied territory, to clear the way for a Palestinian state. It's one thing to say you believe in the state. It's another thing to tell us what's your political strategy for getting there, and I don't hear that.
Michael Lynk, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Time now to get our panel's perspective. Joining me from Massachusetts is Sara Yael Hirschhorn. She is an historian at the University of Haifa, and she's a fellow of the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. Also with us is Khalil Jahshan. He is Executive Director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. And joining us too is Nabil Khoury. He is a former U.S. diplomat and a Middle East expert. Welcome to all of you to the show. Sara, good to have you with us. This inquiry by the United Nations panel, it says that the judgment that they made, the judgment of genocide, it meets 4 of the 5 legal criteria to make that judgment. What is your reaction to the report?
Well, frankly, I found the report to be faulty, cherry-picking data, and relying basically on a Hamas narrative of the conflict. And you don't have to rely on my position here. I think you could also consult war studies experts such as Professor John Spencer or Andrew Fox, and many others today who have commented on social media about the substance of the report. I think it's very troubling that the United Nations does not seem to recognize that Israel is at war with Hamas. At some point, and no point in the 72-page document is Hamas really recognized as a 30,000 strong militant force, and that there is a conflict here that started on October 7th when Hamas invaded Israeli territory, violated Israel's sovereignty, took over 200 people hostage, 48 both dead and alive remain in Gaza, which was mentioned only a few times in a cursory way, hostages, including those who are already dead, including babies and the elderly, into captivity. And the report also doesn't really seem to distinguish between civilians and combatants, the fact that Hamas uses civilians as human shields, and also that war, unfortunately, causes casualties, something that Hamas obviously considered when it invaded Israeli territory on October 7th and started this conflict. Unfortunately, involved the civilian Gazan population in a conflagration that didn't need to happen. So I think that the UN report is very flawed. And the UN consistently has, in fact, included in some of its agencies have been involved in aiding and abetting Hamas since October 7th, that I don't think can really be used as a reliable source to determine what is going on in Gaza, which obviously involves desperate civilian situations and casualties, but is a war and is not a genocide.
Sara, you say the report is flawed and you have found parts of it to be faulty. Could you give us some examples of where these faults are?
Well, I think first of all that the report relies almost exclusively on the Hamas narrative and Hamas data. It's taken their facts and figures as the true and honest estimate of casualties, which does not in any way recognize the difference between combatants and civilians, has obviously inflated the death toll severely, and generally is not recognizing its own role in the conflict of using the civilian population as a human shield. It all seems to conflate war with the legal definition of genocide. Unfortunately, there are civilian casualties in a war. That does not mean that it's a campaign of extermination or a campaign with genocidal intent. In fact, Israel has made efforts that I think we've seen in almost no other conflict around the world to offer evacuation notices to inform the civilian population ahead of time of military operations in their areas and neighborhoods. I mean, these things are almost unknown in any other part of the world. And finally, I think that the UN, because its own agencies have been implicated in October 7th itself, as well as in the subsequent months and now years after this event, I don't think it's really a reliable partner. And I also want to push back on what your previous guest, Michael Lynk, had mentioned to say that there have been no systematic reports that have analyzed this from the Israeli perspective. And indeed there have, including the one from the Begin Sadat Center at Tel Aviv University that was published only last week, that went into excruciating detail in hundreds of pages about the allegations of genocide and starvation from the data that was available, both from the United Nations and other sources.
Okay, Khalil, Jahshan, this is not the first time that Israel has been accused of committing a genocide. What did you make of this report, and do you think this particular report is going to make a difference?
Yes, I think essentially the report sums up the general consensus around the world in terms of legal scholars, including Israeli legal scholars. I mean, with all due respect to Sara, she seems to have been in a bubble somewhere, isolated for the past 2 years. You get Israeli human rights organizations, well respected all over the world, including B'Tselem, including Physicians for Human Rights. You get Israeli scholars, not only in Israel itself, but outside, Omer Bartov, Amos Goldberg, and many others have reached the same conclusion, looking at the same facts. These are not, as she claims, facts that are distorted or facts from Hamas. As a matter of fact, the US government has been for years using the health ministry's statistics in Gaza for victims since the beginning of the occupation. Now, all of a sudden, for argumentation's sake, as a debate tactic, they are thinking or accusing the Ministry of Health for being a Hamas stooge or inaccurate. As a matter of fact, the State Department, until recently, continues to argue that the statistics coming out of the health department in Gaza they continue to be accurate. As far as the UN implications, this has proven to be wrong all along. I assume that Sara was referring to emotional charges at one point, targeting basically not just one organization in the UN that caters for the needs of the refugees, UNRWA, and claiming that UNRWA was involved, or there are some employees of UNRWA who were affiliated with Hamas, and this has proven to be not the pattern, and it's wrong the way Israel and its agents and propagandists and Hasbaratis are arguing, including what we heard from Sara today. I think the decision essentially summarizes the world consensus on this.
I'm not an agent of the Israeli government.
You sound like it. I didn't say you were, but you definitely sound like it.
Okay, I want to get to Nabil Khouri. Nabil Khouri, there have been a whole lot of developments that have taken place over the past few weeks. In addition to this report being released, there was an emergency summit of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The Emir of Qatar has criticized Israel for attacking his country. Where is all this leading to?
First of all, it's disappointing to hear Sara denying what the whole world now recognizes as a fact. Where is this all leading to? I think with the Israeli attack on the Palestinian delegation in Doha and this final push to take and level Gaza City, when you combine that with Rubio's remarks when he finished meeting with Netanyahu and said that there may not be a diplomatic solution for the Gaza situation. You combine all this, and it's really the end of diplomacy. If there was any doubt, I mean, you entice Hamas to participate, to negotiate, and to send a delegation. They sent a delegation to Cairo and then to Doha with not only US approval, but US instigation. And then you try to kill them over there while they are there to negotiate. I think the United Nations is in a very poor place right now at this, its 80th anniversary. But it's clear that Israel is pushing ahead with plans that it had from the very beginning to clear Gaza one way or another. And this assault on Gaza City right now looks like the final phase of ethnic cleansing. Those who survive, and I don't see how the death toll is not going to rise and rise sharply from famine and fatigue, if nothing else. And I think right now this is going to happen. I don't see anybody standing in the face of this.
Yeah.
Sara refers to it as a war. If it is a war, it is one-sided. Hamas manages some brave acts of resistance.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's not a two-sided war.
Okay, I want to get back to Sara. Sara, we have heard that this ground offensive that Israel has launched on Gaza City will result in many, many more people being killed. It could reinforce these findings of genocide. I mean, daily we see these pictures of tower blocks being demolished, being leveled to the ground. What is Israel's goal?
Look, I just want to say that myself, and I would say over 75% of the Israeli population, according to the latest polling, does not support offensive in Gaza City and rejects the Netanyahu administration's, I think, mythology of some kind of total victory in Gaza, which seems that it isn't going to happen. And even if it could happen, which seems very unlikely, to kill Hamas, which is an idea as much as as a terrorist organization, is going to cause large civilian death. And I don't think anybody disagrees with this, including those who are protesting on the streets of Israel every Saturday night, in the hundreds of thousands, and hostages or former hostages who have come forward and said this is going to endanger the lives of the 20 remaining living hostages and obviously hinder the return of the bodies of those who have passed away. So I think Israel's goal here is not aligned with Netanyahu's goal here. In fact, the IDF command, the head of the IDF command, Al Zamir, explicitly rejected this push into Gaza City and seems to have been overshouted by the most extreme members of the Netanyahu coalition. He himself has questioned what the goals of this offensive are. Will it not lead to some kind of endless Israeli occupation of Gaza?
Yeah.
And the death toll to both, IDF soldiers as well as Gazan civilians is, I think, even unacceptable to the IDF. So there's a lot of questions about why this is going forward and who's in control here, because the population and even the IDF is not particularly supportive of it.
Yeah. Khalil, Jahshan, I've just got 2 minutes left. I want to get to you and to Nabil as well. If you could keep your answer short, please. But what are your worst fears as Israel mounts this offensive on Gaza City?
Essentially, I think the bloodletting that we have witnessed over the past almost 2 years is enough from any perspective, a rational perspective. 65,000 killed among the Palestinians, a small population in Gaza, 10,000 missing, 160,000 injured and maimed for life. That's enough. This war has to stop. And with all due respect to the Secretary of State and to the President, they keep saying they would like the war to stop. And I just listening carefully and analyzing carefully the press conference, both in Tel Aviv and in Doha, I don't think the Secretary of State is serious, nor is the White House.
Okay, Nabil Khoury, as we heard, the United Nations General Assembly is underway in New York. Now, there are several Western countries, among them Britain, France, Australia, Canada, and Belgium. They say they may recognize the Palestinian state. I should mention that almost all of these countries, with the exception of Belgium, I think, continue to supply weapons to Israel. In one instance, Britain, it's been training Israeli soldiers. Will this recognition that they say they may make any difference?
Look, both the latest UN report and all these recognitions that are coming in, welcome as they are, it's a little bit too late. I mean, it's one thing to recognize a Palestinian state, but where on earth do you establish it?
Right.
As I mentioned, Gaza is on its way to be being leveled.
Yeah.
And believe me, the next step is the West Bank and the taking over of the West Bank.
Okay, Nabil, I'm sorry I have to interrupt. We've run out of time. We need to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for another edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.